The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, was one of the most notorious methods of execution in medieval Europe. Victims would be tied down to a giant wooden wheel, and their limbs were systematically smashed with a heavy iron club or hammer. The broken body would then be left twisted into the wheel as it was displayed publicly, sometimes raised up on a post for everyone to see. Death didn't come quickly. In many cases, people lingered for days in agony before finally succumbing to shock or dehydration. The wheel wasn't just about pain, it was about spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch, and the slow process made sure that everyone understood the consequences of crossing the law. Scaphism. Scaphism wasn't just brutal, it was psychological torture wrapped in slow-motion death. Ancient Persian sources describe it as a punishment reserved for the worst criminals, like traitors or those who had deeply offended the state. Imagine being trapped between two hollowed-out logs, your arms and legs sticking out but your torso sealed tight. At first, the idea might sound strange, but the logic was horrifyingly clever. Victims were force-fed until they vomited, bloated with milk and honey, leaving their bodies weak and vulnerable. Then their skin was smeared with honey, essentially turning them into a living buffet for flies, mosquitoes, and ants. The victim wasn't killed outright. Instead, they were left floating on a stagnant pond or tied near swamps where insects were thick. Slowly, over days or even weeks, insects would crawl into every wound, lay eggs, and eat the body alive. All the while, the victim remained conscious for much of the ordeal. Greek historians even wrote that the punishment was designed to let nature itself carry out the execution. It wasn't just about killing the condemned, it was about turning their body into a horror story for others to witness. To this day, Scaphism stands as one of the most grotesque examples of how creativity and cruelty can intertwine in human history. Impalement. Impalement may be the punishment most closely associated with fear itself. Though practiced in various cultures, its most infamous use came during the reign of Vlad II of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. His cruelty was not random. It was a deliberate tactic to terrify enemies and maintain control. Impalement involved forcing a sharpened wooden stake into a victim's body, often through the rectum, and letting gravity slowly drag them downward. Unlike quick executions like hanging, this process was slow, excruciating, and humiliating. Historical accounts suggest that some victims lived for hours, even days, suspended in agony while onlookers watched. Vlad reportedly impaled thousands of Ottoman invaders during one campaign, leaving their bodies in rows like a forest of human suffering. To his enemies, it was psychological warfare. To his people, it was both a terror and a warning. Loyalty meant survival, betrayal meant unimaginable pain. Even outside Vlad's reign, impalement was used across parts of the Ottoman Empire and Asia for centuries. The very mention of it would cause entire towns to surrender without a fight. It wasn't just an execution, it was theater, designed to burn an image of horror into everyone's mind. Lingqi. Death by 1,000 cuts. Lingqi is often remembered as one of the most infamous punishments in Chinese history, and for good reason. Translating to slow slicing or lingering death, it was not just a way to kill, but a way to disgrace. The process began with the condemned tied to a wooden frame. Executioners would then begin slicing pieces of flesh from the arms, chest, and legs. Each cut was designed to prolong pain, and the victim was kept conscious for as long as possible. Unlike other methods, Lingqi wasn't about speed or spectacle. It was about slow, deliberate destruction. But what made it even worse was the cultural significance. In traditional Chinese belief, dying with your body intact was essential for spiritual peace in the afterlife. Lingqi robbed victims of that, leaving them physically and spiritually destroyed. Families of the condemned were often shamed, carrying the weight of dishonor for generations. Records show Lingqi was still used as late as the early 20th century, with the last known execution in 1905. Foreign observers at the time were horrified, and photographs of Lingqi circulated widely, cementing its reputation as one of the cruelest punishments ever conceived. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. In Imperial China, Lingqi, often called death by 1,000 cuts, was a method of execution used for severe crimes like treason or parricide. The condemned was tied to a post, and executioners would slowly slice off pieces of flesh over time. Contrary to the name, it wasn't literally 1,000 cuts, but it was prolonged enough to keep the victim conscious through much of it. Lingqi wasn't just about death, it was about dishonor. The body was mutilated in such a way that it denied the person wholeness in the afterlife, adding spiritual torment to physical pain. It was finally banned in 1905, but not before centuries of use. Rat torture. During the Middle Ages and even in later times, rats were weaponized as instruments of punishment. The most notorious version involved placing a cage full of rats against a victim's body, often the stomach or chest. The cage would be heated from behind with fire, forcing the rats to burrow into the flesh to escape the heat. Because rats are natural diggers, they would claw and bite their way into the body, creating unspeakable agony. Rat torture has shown up in historical records and literature, often symbolizing mankind's darkest imagination. Brazen bull. The brazen bull was an invention of ancient Greece, attributed to Perillos of Athens. It was a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull, with a door on the side. Victims were locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath, slowly roasting them alive. The design was especially cruel because the metal would amplify the screams, making them sound like the bellowing of a bull. The execution was a twisted mix of engineering and cruelty, turning human suffering into a form of theatrical entertainment. Ironically, the inventor himself is said to have been the first to suffer inside his own creation, the rack. The rack was one of the most infamous torture devices in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. The victim was tied down with wrists and ankles secured to rollers on either end of a wooden frame. As the rollers turned, the body was stretched slowly, dislocating joints and tearing muscles. The popping sounds of ligaments snapping made it even more terrifying. Victims often confessed to crimes just to make it stop. While not always intended to kill outright, the damage was so severe that many never fully recovered, and some did die from shock or internal injuries. Crucifixion. One of the most well-known forms of execution, crucifixion was used by the Romans and others as a punishment for rebels and criminals. Victims were nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left hanging, sometimes for days. The pain wasn't just from the nails, but from the slow process of suffocation. Hanging by the arms made it incredibly difficult to breathe, forcing the victim to push up on nailed feet just to take a breath. This cycle of pain and exhaustion would go on until they could no longer lift themselves. It was as much about humiliation as it was about death, as crucifixions were carried out publicly. Sawing. One of the most nightmarish punishments ever imagined was sawing. Victims were hung upside down, which kept them conscious longer because blood flowed to the brain, and then they were literally sawed in half from the groin downward. Sometimes executioners stopped partway, leaving victims alive and suffering for hours. This method was recorded in parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. It was designed to be a horrifying spectacle and served as the ultimate deterrent. Putting it all into perspective, when you hear about these punishments, it's easy to feel sick, and that's the point. Human history is filled with examples of cruelty, often justified in the name of justice, order, or even entertainment. These punishments weren't just about pain, they were psychological weapons, meant to terrify entire populations into obedience. Today, we see them as barbaric and inhumane, but they remind us of how far society has come in valuing human rights, dignity, and compassion. The fact that many of these punishments shock us so deeply is proof that our sense of justice has evolved, but it's also a reminder of what humans are capable of when fear and power rule over empathy.